The Cincinnati Bengals finished the 2024 season with a 9-8 record and missed the playoffs for the second straight year. And despite the Bengals finishing with the most points in a season in franchise history, as well as Joe Burrow for throwing for nearly 5,000 yards and 43 passing touchdowns, and even star receiver Jamar Chase winning the Triple Crown, the 2024 season for the Cincinnati Bengals felt like one big letdown.
But none of these problems are Joe Burrow problems. If they got 99 problems, Joe Burrow ain't one.
This was a team that finished 6th in points per game and scored 33 or more points in 7 of 17 games last year, yet were just 3-4 in those games. Whether it was losing to the Patriots on opening day, who would go on to finish with a top 5 draft pick, or losing in Arrowhead to the Chiefs in week 2 by a single point,
and it's broken up and there's no flag. Home flag comes in.
Or losing to the Jaden Daniels-led Commanders in Week 3 with a score of 38-33, it was one thing after another for the 2024 Bengals. Or perhaps best of all, Jamar Chase having a combined 21 receptions for 457 yards and 5 touchdowns against the Ravens in the 2 games they played, and in 2 games where the Bengals put up a combined 72 points, yet were swept by the future division champions. And unfortunately, that's the type of year it was last year. But as we enter 2025, you have to think, surely it cannot be as bad as it was defensively last year. Surely we are not going to go through another year like that, and whenever we put up 33 points in a game this year, we're going to have a winning record, right? Well, we're going to break everything down with the 2025 Bengals in today's video, and realistically what we should expect from them. If you could like the video before we start, I would really appreciate it, and without further ado, let's begin! And we are starting today's video by discussing who the Bengals brought in and who they lost this offseason. And one of the first things we have to discuss with the Bengals is to acknowledge this franchise is unique in the way they go about operating their business. Their books, meaning their accounting books, are usually pretty clean and they very rarely have dead money or large amounts of dead money, and this offseason was no different. They had just $11 million in dead cap money, which ranked 30th in the NFL, and credit to the Bengals front office for having this be the case. There's several other teams that have dead cap hits from a single player, more than the entire Bengals team has in dead cap money entering 2025. And not only that, but this team was also not going to be very active in free agency this year because they had a few players to retain before they could even think about bringing in someone like Noah Fant on a 1-year $2.75 million deal, which they eventually did, by the way. The Bengals' biggest priority this offseason, or priorities, was to bring back both Jamar Chase and T. Higgins, and we've discussed this on the channel before, but paying players and giving out guaranteed contracts is not as simple as snapping your finger. Guarantees are huge, and the guarantees have to be set aside from the owner, and just because all NFL owners are billionaires does not mean they're all on the same level of wealth. And Mike Brown is not on the same level as the Waltons or the Walton family who own the Denver Broncos, meaning it's not as easy for Mike Brown to come up with guarantees and contracts for guys like Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, and T. Higgins as it is the Waltons. So this has always been the issue with retaining the big three on offense, and Trey Hendrickson on defense for that matter too. And for anyone who has watched the channel for any amount of time, I appreciate you watching by the way, but I never thought Cincinnati would keep all three and that they would take a first-round pick for T. Higgins from a team like New England or a high second-round pick from a team like New England if it was offered, but they didn't. And credit Cincinnati for keeping everyone in the Queen City. And now that all of the contracts are figured out, well, this is the cost of having good players. The Bengals have 41.3% of their 2025 salary cap tied up with Joe Burrow, T. Higgins, Jamar Chase, and Trey Hendrickson, and that actually balloons up to 46.7% when you add in Orlando Brown Jr. at left tackle too, and this is all per Spottrack.com. So outside of bringing those guys back, the Bengals were not that active of a team in free agency as they brought in TJ Slayton, a defensive lineman from the Packers, Noah Fant, the tight end from the Seahawks, Oren Burks, a linebacker from the Eagles, and they also brought back Samaje Perine, a running back who spent 2023 with the Broncos and 2024 with the Chiefs. They also brought back a couple of players in Joseph Ossai and Marco Wilson. Unfortunately, the Bengals did move on from several veterans this offseason as they released Alex Kappa, who signed with the Raiders. They also released Sheldon Rankins, who signed with the Texans, and they released Jermaine Pratt, who joined Alex Kappa in Las Vegas. Typically, the Bengals are not the biggest free agent spenders, and whenever they do give out big contracts, it's usually with 1 year of guarantees. And for reference, they gave safety Geno Stone a 2-year, $14 million contract last year in free agency, with 6 guaranteed. And by doing this, the Bengals protect themselves from having a huge dead cap hit, like the Broncos did a couple of years ago with Russell Wilson. That's also not to say they never spend money in free agency either, because a couple of years ago they did give a 4-year, $64 million contract to Orlando Brown Jr. in free agency. They're just usually not the biggest free agency winners year in and year out, but for this free agency cycle specifically, their goals were clear: keep everyone in-house, and that's exactly what they did. Now, for the 2025 Bengals defense, they have a new defensive coordinator in Al Golden, who is replacing Lou Anarumo, who is now the defensive coordinator for the Indianapolis Colts. But I'll be honest, as we head into 2025, I have a lot of concerns with this defense entering the year. Trey Hendrickson has been phenomenal over the last 2 years, period. He has 35 sacks in the last 34 games and is coming off of a year in which he finished second in Defensive Player of the Year voting, while leading the league in both pressures and sacks. And while he has played the last 2 years, and these last 2 years specifically, at a Hall of Fame level, what exactly has that meant for the Bengals defense? Now, I am willing to dismiss 2023 because of the fact Joe Burrow got hurt midway through the year, but that was still a team that was 5-4 at the time, and again, had a slow start under head coach Zach Taylor. And here's a fact about the 2024 Bengals that applies directly to their defense: they tied for the most losses in a season this century when scoring at least 25 points in a game offensively, as they went 5-6 in those games. The NFL winning percentage in those circumstances this century is 81% for reference. And when you ask the question, how did the Bengals get better this offseason from a defensive perspective? Well, how did they? TJ Slayton was their biggest free agent signing, and he's not that great of a player. He's not going to come in and help this defense go from finishing 27th in rushing DVOA to top 20, much less top 15. And one of my biggest concerns with the 2025 Bengals defense is the uncertainty around a lot of players. I'm fine with projecting a player to break out here or there, but when this defense outside of Trey Hendrickson consists of guys like Myles Murphy, TJ Slayton, Demetrius Knight, and Oren Burks, who, by the way, has been in the NFL since 2018, yet has only played 1,100 career defensive snaps, I have a lot of concerns. And while schematically speaking, I do think the Bengals are going to be more aggressive with Al Golden than they were with Lou Anarumo, I kind of ask the question, does it matter? Can you realistically win a race driving a GMC terrain against other teams in the conference that are driving Ferraris and Lamborghinis? No, and that's my biggest concern with the Bengals in 2025. As we all saw in Super Bowl 59, trench play matters most, and always will. And outside of Trey Hendrickson, who do the Bengals have that can consistently get home and disrupt passing plays when they need to? And I don't think you can point to anyone on this team with any sort of confidence. Trey Hendrickson had 83 pressures last year, and the next closest Bengal was, you guessed it, BJ Hill with 32 pressures. And I would be very surprised if Myles Murphy breaks out in year 3 based on what we've seen in the first 2 years of his career. Shamar Stewart was always a project player, with or without the contract dispute this offseason, and I didn't think he was going to be that productive of a rookie regardless, because I thought this was a player that would produce more in 2026 than in 2025. Football is obviously a complementary game, and this especially applies to the Bengals secondary. A good pass rush can complement a good secondary, and vice versa, but does anyone have any sort of confidence in the Bengals corners this year? Cam Taylor-Britt runs hot and cold, and there's times, like the Kansas City game last year, where he looks like a really, really good player, but then there will be multiple games where he's not in the same stratosphere. And my biggest thing with the 2025 Bengals defense is not that I think this roster is terrible, it's the fact that there are a lot of uncertainties within this roster, and the fact you kind of have to hope everything works out. And when teams are in this situation, more often than not, it doesn't. I definitely have concerns with the Bengals safety room, and I know Bengals fans do too, and for me to buy in with this defense this year, there's too many eggs in the basket of hoping things go the right way. I know Al Golden loves his linebackers, and I think Logan Wilson is in for a big year, but I'm not going into a season fully trusting Oren Burks when they're in base rather than nickel, and like with a lot of the defense, there's uncertainties around Demetrius Knight Jr. too. Overall, I think this defense will finish in the 23 to 27 range in 2025. For the 2025 Bengals rookie impact, I'll be honest, I think they're going to have lower rookie impact than a lot of other teams for a couple of reasons. This, by the way, has nothing to do with the Shamar Stewart contract situation that played out a lot longer than probably Shamar Stewart, the Bengals front office, and Bengals fans wanted to all summer, and that could be an entire couple of minute segment on its own, but this has nothing to do with that. With Shamar Stewart, the football player, this was a player that would flash at a really high level at times, and that his highs were up there with Abdul Carter and with other great pass rushers over the past couple of years. The problem was the consistency was certainly not there, and the fact that he also had 4.5 career sacks in nearly 40 career collegiate games. Now, I am definitely under the belief that sacks are not everything, and that therefore if you have a 13 sack season and somebody like Max Crosby has a 10 sack season, that therefore this player who had 7 sacks in 2023 and 14 sacks in 2024 is now better than Max Crosby, just for clarity to kind of lay our cards out there. But there is something to be noted about a player that only had 4.5 career sacks in nearly 40 career collegiate games, and now we are going up a level in competition. So I don't think that Shamar Stewart is ever going to be a consistent double-digit sack player, although I would certainly welcome being wrong. And how that translates to the 2025 Bengals preview is I don't think he's going to come in and win the Defensive Rookie of the Year, largely because that is a sack-based award, and Shamar Stewart kind of, struggles to finish plays behind the line of scrimmage and therefore struggles to get sacks, again, based on 4.5 career collegiate sacks with 1.5 sacks in each of his seasons at Texas A&M. Now, with Shamar Stewart's rookie production, you kind of also have to ask the question of how much is he going to play, because we have Myles Murphy, and how much is Shamar Stewart actually going to see the field. And I would consider it a successful season for Shamar Stewart if he has 30 pressures, along with 3, maybe 4 sacks, and I think that would be a good baseline for what we should expect in 2026 and beyond. And what should be remembered is Shamar Stewart was a project player to begin with, and that with the way that he tested, he was not a finished product, because if he was, he would have very easily went top 5 in this class if he was a finished product. Now, with the second round selection in South Carolina linebacker Demetrius Knight Jr., this was a prospect who I didn't dislike, but I'm not the biggest fan of selecting him in the top 50 and hoping everything works out, because Demetrius Knight is a 25-year-old rookie, and whenever you have a 25-year-old rookie, 99.9% of the time that translates to a low ceiling player. So we selected a project pass rusher in the first round, and then we selected a player or a linebacker, which is already a lower positional value, in the second round, who is older and has a low ceiling. And this was one of the reasons as to why I gave the Bengals the lowest draft grade out of any team in draft weekend. And for me, I also didn't really care for what they did after the Demetrius Knight selection, and that will obviously start with Dylan Fairchild, their third round selection, an offensive lineman from Georgia. But pertaining to Demetrius Knight Jr., this was a player that struggled at times in coverage during his time at South Carolina, and believe it or not, when you're in a division with Lamar Jackson and Aaron Rodgers as a rookie, I don't think that that's magically going to get better, going from the SEC to playing against not just one, but multiple former MVP winners. So I think there's going to be a bit of a transition period for Demetrius Knight, and in some ways, he's kind of going to be a situational player, and he's going to be in far more run situations than he will be in pass situations. And if Al Golden has him in definitive passing situations early, I do think in some ways that will be setting Demetrius Knight up to fail. Now, with Dylan Fairchild, the interior offensive lineman from Georgia, this was a player I had around player 146 on my top 150, and I was not a fan of this selection, taking him in the top 85, especially when Wyatt Milam, the offensive lineman who went to the Jags, was a player that was taken about 8 selections later. And for reference, I had Milam in my top 70. I thought Milam's play strength was significantly higher than Fairchild's play strength, and I don't think Fairchild will have the play strength to be able to hold up in the AFC North, especially with Cam Hayward and Nnamdi Madubuike, and God forbid if Mason Graham works out, that's going to be a guy that has to wrestle with those 3 beasts 6 times a year for a third of your schedule, knowing the offensive line struggle that Joe Burrow has already dealt with through the first 5 years of his career. So I was not a fan of this selection. And whenever you go through the rankings that I had on Shamar Stewart, which was player 31 on my board, drafted him at 17. Demetrius Knight, I had him at 74. They took him at 49. And Dylan Fairchild, I had him at 146. They took him at 81 or 82. That was not a good process for the Bengals, and I thought they reached on all 3 of their first selections. And then they also took Barrett Carter, another linebacker linebacker from Clemson with their 4th round pick. So I didn't really care for what the Bengals did in the draft, and I don't think they're going to have a lot of rookie impact. And even in the best case scenario, I mean, a top tier pass rusher is the best case scenario for Shamar Stewart, but that's a huge gamble in itself, hoping that a player who had 4.5 career collegiate sacks all of a sudden flips a switch and turns it completely around at the NFL level. So I don't think the Bengals are going to have a lot of rookie impact. I hope I'm wrong for the sake of Bengals fans, but I was not a big fan of this draft class, and there was a reason that we gave this draft class a C- grade. So I kind of asked the question, what is the best case outcome for the 2025 Bengals draft class? Shamar Stewart magically flips a switch and becomes a great NFL player. Great if that happens, although statistically that is unlikely, and I think Bengals fans would even acknowledge how unlikely that is, at least pertaining to the 2025 Bengals. A 25-year-old linebacker who has a limited ceiling and a player who struggled in coverage at times at the SEC level, let alone the NFL level, and an interior offensive lineman who showed times at Georgia where he was not as strong as he should be in the SEC, let alone a league that is going to be a lot more physically demanding and a lot stronger in the NFL than what Dylan Fairchild showed during his time at Georgia, and then another linebacker in Barrett Carter, and then another offensive lineman in Jalen Rivers from Miami, who was by every definition a depth offensive lineman, and I wouldn't expect much from him, and then running back Taj Brooks late in the 6th round when you already have Chase Brown, although Taj Brooks is not really that, there's not going to a lot be expected from him from a 6th round rookie running back. So I don't think that there's going to be that much rookie impact, needless to say, for the 2025 Cincinnati Bengals. I welcome being wrong. I just don't see an outcome for this team specifically where, hey, we are going to have a really, really solid draft class, and that this is going to be the turning point from having no defense and from being Joe Burrow, Jamar, and T and everybody else, and Trey Hendrickson, to having this draft class that we can build off of for 2026 and beyond. Now, for the 2025 Bengals offense, this again should be one of the most fun units to watch. This was a team last year that finished 6th in points per game, and Joe Burrow, credit to him, played at an MVP level last year. And unfortunately for Joe and Bengals fans, whenever you are on a team that misses the playoffs 99% of the time, you are not going to win the MVP award, largely because that is also based on team success. And Joe Burrow definitely was one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL last year. I mean, he threw for over 4,900 yards, had 43 passing touchdowns to just 9 interceptions, and there was an 8-game span where he had 3 passing touchdowns in every game, and during this 8-game span had a 27-5 touchdown to interception ratio. And while Joe Burrow may take a step back statistically this year, as it's going to be incredibly tough to repeat the type of success he had last year, the Bengals are going to be one of the better units in the NFL, offensively speaking, and it's due in large part to having a quarterback that can win the MVP award at any time, a receiver one that just won the Triple Crown award and is one of the top 2 receivers in the NFL. I'll leave that ranking for your interpretation, and also having a really good Robin to the wide receiver one's Batman and Jamar Chase, and that is of course T. Higgins being the Robin to Jamar Chase's Batman. And one of my frustrations with the Bengals that we did not really discuss on or touch on earlier was the fact that they don't pay their players, because if they've proven anything over the past couple of years, especially with Joe Burrow and Jamar paying those guys a combined, $400+ million, and now T. Higgins' contract for that matter too, and then even going out and getting Orlando Brown Jr. in free agency and working out a deal with Trey Hendrickson and being able to keep Mike Gesicki. Obviously the old narrative of the Bengals and not paying their players is, it was a narrative for a reason, or a reputation for a reason. But what frustrates me with the Bengals and why I'm going to be limited on this team, or why I'm going to be lower on this team's ceiling, is because if they would have paid T. Higgins from the start, like they should have a couple of years ago whenever we were discussing offseason moves, we should have discussed a T. Higgins contract extension 2 offseason previews ago. And that's one of the most frustrating aspects, because now we are paying T. Higgins a lot more. Not that he's not worth the contract, but you could have signed T. Higgins to a deal that, DK Metcalf signed a couple of off seasons ago, which was a 3 for $72 type contract where you were paying him $24 per year. And if you would have paid Jamar Chase last offseason, like the Vikings did with Justin Jefferson, then, and this was before the Triple Crown win, by the way, credit to Jamar Chase for, standing on business and winning the Triple Crown, you could have saved an average of $4 or $5 million per year with both Jamar Chase and T. Higgins, and this all plays into why I'm going to be lower on the Bengals team ceiling this year, because if you would have saved $4 or $5 million per year with each player, we could have invested that extra $9 or $10 million in another good quality offensive lineman. Now, for this team's ability to run the football, I still have questions around the offensive line, and while Orlando Brown Jr. isn't bad, he's certainly not an elite offensive tackle, and I do think there is a possibility that Amarius Mims takes a jump in year 2, and I was a huge fan of Amarius Mims coming out last year, and I want to credit the Bengals for drafting Amarius Mims in a good situation for him to personally succeed in, as entering 2024, there were 3 ginormous offensive tackles on the roster in Mims, Orlando Brown, and of course Trent Brown. So whenever you have a normal 6'5", 320-pound offensive lineman, that's a little different than Amarius, Trent Brown, and Orlando Brown all being 6'7", 6'8", 340 pounds, and the ways that they have to win through leverage, and of course, in the run game, being able to get down and being able to move guys in the run game. And I think that now that Amarius Mims has more experience underneath his belt, which was a concern for him coming out of Georgia last year, as he only played in 11 career collegiate games, or started 11 career collegiate games. I think we're going to see a step from him in 2025, but I really do worry about the interior offensive line and how they're going to be able to pave the way for Chase Brown, because this was a team last year that finished 20th in average yards per carry as a team, and they also finished 16th in rushing DVOA. And whenever you think about the elite running attacks around the NFL, I don't think the Bengals are going to finish anywhere close to the top 7, 8, or 10 units this year, and in a lot of ways it's going to again be on Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, and T. Higgins to really pave the way for success for this offense. And by the way, I do want to credit Mitchell Tinsley for making the 53-man roster. There was a really cool video about him going around, and he had one hell of a preseason and one great game against the Washington Commanders in the preseason. But pertaining to the 2025 Bengals' success, I would be very surprised if they're anything above the 14 or 15 area, which is not in the best of the best conversation. So again, I think it's going to come down to the big 3 on offense paving the way, and hopefully we have a really good year for Mike Gesicki or Noah Fant, and that somebody else takes a step up. But that's what's going to come down to for the 2025 Bengals. Now, if there is any criticism to have about Joe Burrow, there's certainly times where he holds on to the ball a lot longer than he should, and he certainly takes some unnecessary sacks, but I don't think that Joe Burrow taking a sack here or there is going to kill the Bengals' chances of going from a 9-win team to a 12-win team over the course of a 17-game season. This is going to be a team that's going to be predicated on the passing attack, which they were, of course, last year, and from a projection standpoint for Joe Burrow, I think he'll be above 4,500 passing yards again, which is the most that we've projected for any player in the 2025 team preview series. And for Jamar Chase, as long as he stays healthy, I would be pretty surprised if he's under 1,400 or 1,500 yards this year, along with double-digit touchdowns. And for T. Higgins too, again, barring health, I'd be very surprised if he's under 1,000 yards, especially with a 17-game season. The biggest thing for the 2025 Bengals is they cannot afford another slow start, which they are notorious for under head coach Zach Taylor. They started out 0-3 last year, and it came back and bit them in the rear end because they were relying on the Chiefs' backups to beat the Broncos in Week 18, which, as we know, did not happen. Their first 2 games at Cleveland and home against the Jags this year, I don't want to say are must win, but you cannot afford to start out 0-2, so in some ways they are can't lose games, and after that, the schedule gets pretty difficult as they go to Minnesota in Week 3, then go to Denver in Week 4, then come home to play the Lions in Week 5, then go to Green Bay in Week 6, who recently acquired Micah Parsons, and then come home to play the Steelers in Week 7. And even in the back half of the schedule, there is a 3-game stretch where they play at Baltimore on Thanksgiving night, then go to Buffalo, and then come home to play Baltimore. That is a brutal 3-game stretch, and you would probably think that they're going to lose out of any of those 7 or 8 games we just mentioned due to the defense not being as good as other teams' defenses across the NFL. They're probably going to be at least 3 or 4 losses in there, and then you kind of have the discussion of, well, how many losses can we have before we get, too far out of the postseason, kind of like last year. And my point is, the Bengals cannot have as many whoopsie games as they had last year, and that came back and bit them in the rear end. Now, the one thing about the 2025 Bengals that I do not trust the way that I trust another team like the Ravens defense or the Bills defense is the Bengals defense. I think that's going to limit this team, and that's why I have the 2025 Bengals team ceiling as a divisional round exit. It has nothing to do with the big 3 on offense or Trey Hendrickson himself on defense, because they have proven time and time again that they are very, very good at what they do, and especially Joe Burrow and Jamar last year, who were amongst the best in the NFL at their position. And Jamar, of course, was the best at his position because he won the Triple Crown. But when it comes hell or high water, guys, I'm not going to trust the 2025 Bengals defense to stop other elite teams in the AFC when it matters. I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, as I truly cannot thank you guys enough for the support, and football season is almost here. Until next time, please be safe and have a great day. Love you guys.